Today I have the honor of finally doing a video with Colin Gorrie, who is recently I first became aware of you actually through Oswald Bera um, on Luke Ranieri's channel when you sort of walked him through a draft of one of the chapters um, with this sort of comprehensible input approach. And then I sort of went to your channel and looked at a few of your conlanging videos, which I found very exciting. That's something I'd always sort of thought about doing myself, but I didn't have the holistic knowledge of grammar changes and stuff. So I always I would have done basic phonological stuff, and I would have been limited by my knowledge of Indo-European languages and stuff like that. So that's something I really enjoy. Um, and recently, Colin has released a very different kind of Old English learner called Oswald Bera. It's weird to slip into Old English phonology halfway through modern English, but he takes an approach where it's basically a novel that has a very engaging plot. I was expecting it to be interesting, but I read it and it's like you actually want to find out what happens to the character. It's very much like the story is. It would be interesting even if it were written in modern English, obviously. Um, but it basically builds up. It's entirely in Old English, and it builds you up through the chapters, introducing more and more vocabulary and kind of reinforcing things and going back and making sure that, triangulating on certain words to make sure you understand them through this comprehensible input method. Um, and as someone who's focused on Old English phonology and the history of English pronunciation, um, I notoriously have made several grammatical mistakes when I've tried to foray into morphology and stuff. So this has been extremely helpful to me, just having access to drafts of it before it was released. Um, just you immediately start to understand the language on its own terms, and you don't feel like you're using a proxy in modern English too much. It starts to make sense as Old English rather than being filtered through modern English. So we could start by talking about just what comprehensible input is and how it compares to other methods of language teaching, especially
Certainly,
in ancient context.
certainly. But first, I want to just thank you, Simon, for having me on.
My
It's
pleasure.
the honor is mine,
Oh,
truly.
nice.
I've followed your channel for many years now, and yeah, it's I always point people to you. Someone says, "Hey, how do you pronounce Old English?" Go talk to Simon. Go talk to Simon. Go. Look, he's got like a 2 hour video out now. That should satisfy you for a while. Um, and I also thank you for that explanation of Oswald Bera. I don't think I could actually explain it better
Oh, no.
myself. I think you truly understand um, what I was trying to do with the book. So it is based on this idea of comprehensible input, which is a very foundational idea in the field of second language acquisition. And comprehensible input is at the center of a hypothesis that has been around since for a good few decades now, which is associated with the linguist Stephen Krashen. So some people watching may be familiar with that name or may have heard this, but for those who haven't, comprehensible input is a concept where so we can divide it into two halves. There's the input part. Input is language coming in, messages coming at you in a language, whether they be spoken or written. Um, and comprehensible is actually just what it sounds like. So this is input in the language, language being addressed to you, messages being sent to you that you can comprehend. At least you can comprehend what the message means. Now, from a language learning perspective, there will still be likely things that you don't understand. And in fact, it's ideal if there are a few things you don't understand because then you're not just seeing old material. So comprehensible input looks like it looks like language that is embedded in a context where you can understand what's going on, but there are still a few little new things there for you.
Yeah, I'm very excited by the concept because it's just immediately before you even try it, it's so clearly different from even if you're interested in languages, I find that the textbook kind of, these are the grammatical cases and so on. Those descriptions, they're interesting at first, and then they become quite dry quite quickly. And it's hard to stay kind of, it's difficult to stay on it. Um, and I found you mentioned in your email that one of the interesting things to talk about would be how, um, well, maybe this is the wrong topic to bring up at this point. Um, but I'll just briefly mention it, how you could use a book like this to kind of take off into other Indo-European languages, like the, ancient languages, and also Polish and stuff that still have inflectional morphology, a bit like Proto-Indo-European did. And I find stuff that's fundamentally different between Old English and modern English, like the fact that in a lot of cases you don't really need prepositions because the dative case just does the work of the prepositions. Um, reading a book like this just gives you so much input of that kind of thing where that's used, so that you don't end up kind of making modern English errors and transposing prepositions in where they're not needed and things like that. Um, I suppose that's an observation without a question attached to it. But unless you wanted to expand on such a
Yeah, so maybe I can connect one dot here, which is, or it's hard to connect one thing. Connect two dots here, which is this idea of comprehensible input. How is it useful? Um, Essentially, by processing comprehensible input, by, we're beings, we're social beings, we're attuned to wanting to understand what people are telling us and what messages in our environment mean for us. If you think, if you're exiled by the tribe, that's not a good thing usually, in deep prehistory. So we are attuned to these messages coming at us from other people, and comprehensible input is essentially a way of pitching those messages in a new language so that your mind can start to work on them. So your attention is directed to them, and your mind is working on building a sort of unconscious or implicit knowledge of the language, which is, we can contrast with the explicit knowledge of the language that you get from learning grammatical rules in a traditional textbook. And one fairly mainstream theory in second language acquisition says that those two things are kind of parallel. So your implicit and explicit knowledge of the language are parallel, and they don't necessarily affect each other. So this is the phenomenon that I think many of us are familiar with, where you can go through 4 years of classes in a language, and then you get high marks on everything. You're very confident. You go on a trip to the country and you can't understand anything. You can't communicate. So this is sort of a way of trying to explain that phenomenon, these parallel tracks of implicit and explicit knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that we get of a language, the kind of knowledge we build about a language when we're acquiring our first language is implicit knowledge, which is why, people who only speak English, English is their native language, if they get asked, what's the past subjunctive of to be? And I'm like, what? And yet there it is, it's were. So these two kinds of knowledge can coexist in a person, but they don't necessarily always do so. So then to bring that to the question of what to do with these sorts of grammatical features that are common in Old English and other Indo-European languages, but not common in modern English, such as using case alone to express something like concepts like by means of something, or using something as an instrument. We have this idea of an instrumental case, or an instrumental use of a case, which we see in Old English. You see something like shippe ferdon. So they went by ship. This is, in modern English, we say they went by ship, or on a ship, or using a ship. In Old English, that's accomplished with that little e ending on shippe. And essentially, there you go. There's the explicit grammar of it. But what you really need to get an implicit grammar is to just see it, 20, 30, 50 times in context where you understand what's meant by it. And then you start doing strange things like actually volunteering this kind of construction. You start producing it when you actually want to construct an Old English sentence. You start producing it without thinking like, okay, by means of a ship, that's an instrumental. Ship is neuter noun. The instrumental is going to be a dative and neuter. So you look, what's the ending? It's a. Okay, then you go. That's a very slow process, and you can do it, but it's not the kind of process that underlies normal productive use of the language. So speaking in a conversation, you may do that in composition, but you have time in composition. You have time when you're writing an email in Old English, if that's the kind of thing that you do. But you don't really have time to do that in a real-time conversation such as we're having now. And so my implicit knowledge of modern English is buzzing like crazy throughout this entire process, making sure that I put all the right case markings on the pronouns. Simon is talking to me, I'm talking to him. Me is accusative, him is accusative, but I never thought about that. And I dare say most speakers of modern English wouldn't even be able to express it in those concepts. But there it is. We have case two.
Yeah, I've had conversations when I was at university. I knew a lot of Erasmus students from Europe, and we always had conversations where they'd bring up, you know, grammatical concepts, and then I'd ask, "Oh, how does that what's this in German, and what's it from an explicit perspective?" And they sort of had to think about it quite seriously, and then you know realize they'd made a mistake, and because obviously they just don't think about it that way. Um, and I've had my dad made comments like, I don't know, I'd talk about subjects and objects in English, and he kind of joke that English doesn't have that stuff. That's for foreign languages. But yeah, so I suppose how you would use this book would probably depend on what your goals were. So um, if you wanted to be producing research papers on Old English, you'd probably need to have some explicit knowledge, because not, being able to use the dative doesn't necessarily know that you don't even have to know what the word dative means to be able to use it properly.
In
So
fact, in Old English, we had to wait for Alfrich to come up with a word for
yeah.
dative to explain the Latin dative case. Vorgewenlich, for those keeping track at home, the granting thing, the granting case.
I never thought about that. I don't think I knew offhand what words he'd used. Um, but yeah, so would you say if somebody's eventual aim is to um, kind of do research in this area, would you say that learning by comprehensible input first and then trying to learn the technicalities of it and then being able to recognize, oh, that's what that's called, the dative. I see. I know what that is because I have experience of it. Do you think your book or something like your book is kind of a first step and then you learn the academic stuff afterwards?
You can do it like that. You can also do them in parallel, or you can learn the explicit grammar first and then go to Oswald. I think what getting an implicit knowledge of a language is really useful for doing is making you a fast reader. Because if you want to do research in this field, you're going to need to read texts. And if reading a text for you is a matter of going through every word, finding out what the gender, the number, the case, the tense, the mood, all of these things, looking things up in a dictionary for, 50% of the words because you don't know them, and then coming up with a really nice explicit understanding of a paragraph, that might take you a day, depending on how many words you don't know, depending on how comfortable you are with all of those endings. Whereas if you have an implicit knowledge of the language, that would take you maybe 5 minutes. So imagine how much more you can accomplish when you are able to read in a way that's comparable to what a literate reader of Old English at the time would have done. And this applies across the board to all languages. If you're studying a modern language and you want to study the literature of that language, imagine what kind of a career you would have if reading anything in that language were a laborious process
Yeah.
that took you a whole weekend to get through a page of, Goethe. Would you be a great student of German literature that way? Perhaps not as much as someone who could do that and then do that in, 10 minutes and then spend the rest of their day pondering it and looking at secondary sources and things like that. So I think having a very, very strong ability to read is crucial in whatever you want to do with Old English or any language.
Yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so I wonder about the process. This is kind of part of one of the other things we talked about over email. I wonder about the process of building up the the narrative. So whether you first thought, what's the first vocabulary I should introduce? How, because it obviously gets more in kind of intense as you go along, as you start to understand how the cases work and stuff. It just starts being normal text by a certain point. Um, and whereas at the start, it's a lot more, you know, Oswald is a bear. What is Oswald? He's a bear, because that's how you
Yeah.
how you get into it. Did you did you first come up with what do I want to achieve with each chapter, or did you come up with a narrative and then um, kind of just structure it as necessary in terms of the linguistic content?
I had a few different things I was trying to accomplish at once, and then what happened was the resulting book is kind of a compromise between all of them. So first and foremost, I wanted to tell an engaging story because I think if you can keep people reading Old English, then you can teach them anything you want with enough time. But if they stop, that's the end of it. You've lost your opportunity. So I thought the first thing that I always want to do is make sure that someone keeps reading, which is why I tried to make it as much of a page turner as possible, and even using some potentially cheesy novelist tricks with, cliffhangers at the end of chapters. Someone came to the door? Who is it? Turn the next page to find out, this sort of thing. It's the kind of tricks you would see when novels were serialized. Um, in weekly or monthly magazines. There's no guarantee that the person is going to keep reading. And I think that's always true with any piece of writing. There's no guarantee the person's going to keep reading. You have to give them a reason to do so. And especially when you're asking them to do something hard, like read in a second language. So that was one big goal that I had in mind. Another was to limit the introduction of vocabulary. So between grammar and vocabulary is far more challenging, which seems strange because grammar is kind of abstract and has a reputation of being hard, whereas vocabulary, you just learn the words. But grammar is finite. Vocabulary technically is finite, but it really doesn't feel that way. You have thousands and thousands of words, and the way that word frequency is distributed in texts, you have a few words that make up the bulk of any text. These are sort of usually grammatical words, like in modern English, in, the, to, I, things like that. But then the bulk of any text, the thing that the text is actually talking about, is going to be relatively usually infrequent words. So you have all of this kind of connective tissue around these words. And if you understand, say in a sentence, I went to the blank so that I could blank a blank. What do you know about that sentence? Almost nothing. But you have all of the frequent words.
Yeah,
So if you understand the grammatical glue of a sentence, but not the core vocabulary, not the vocabulary that the text uses to express its meaning, you know nothing, essentially. But if you know just those key items of vocabulary, but you don't really understand the grammar, there are usually only two or three things it could possibly mean.
yeah, yeah,
So if you hear blank, 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 pets, pet store, blank, buy, blank, dog. Well, I kind of get an idea of what's going on. And that gets back to that idea of consuming messages and interpreting messages in the language. So that is actually much more comprehensible, despite the fact that you understand less on paper, than if you understood all the grammar. So all of that is to say that vocabulary is the main limiting factor in comprehension, more so than grammar. Grammar plays a role, obviously, but if you're going to sort of attend to one, let it be vocabulary. And so I very rigorously controlled the introduction of new vocabulary in the book. So that was another thing. A third thing is I wanted to make sure that they're getting relatively representative vocabulary of the text that they may be reading, which is more challenging than it might seem in Old English, because I dare say that a main reason that people learn to read Old English is they want to read poetry. They want to read specifically Beowulf, usually, in my experience. And then once they, along the road to that, they become aware of the riches of Old English literature, and then they get into all of that. But I find that a very common motivation for students coming in is they want to read Beowulf. And Beowulf's diction is very, very different from the diction of a prose author. In fact, Old English verse in general has very different diction than Old English prose. And so you have to deal with this transition between becoming a prose reader and then becoming a reader of poetry. Um, so right away we have a challenge. So what I did was I tried to first of all just by gut make sure the words I was introducing were common enough to be of use to people. Um, and then there was released a frequency dictionary of Old English prose, which helped. And I used that to decide between synonyms, but I generally didn't let that override the other two concerns. So the book as it actually ended up being is a result of compromise between those desires and those goals.
I and another thing I found reading through the narrative is I assume this was driven obviously by the things you talked about, like the desire to make it engaging and cover representative vocabulary, which is sometimes um, in Old English texts, it's kind of like elevated. It's talking about certain things which maybe, the average person talking about their how their cartwheel is broken or something might not be talking about. And he found a way of kind of naturally steering the story in those directions. Um, but I think an emergent property of that is that you kind of take us on a tour of a whole society, whereas any given Old English text will only focus on certain kind of corners of society, and you get um, this you almost come away with this idea of it just being kind of fragmented, and there was just, you know, there were monks over here doing this, and then there were royal households doing this, and then there was a sad man wandering in the wilderness and not related to any of them. But you make it feel very cohesive and paint it as a very colourful culture. And I wondered, was that something you had in? Obviously, it would have been researched and stuff, and of course, because you're aiming at reading particular texts. But is representing the culture something you thought about a lot while you were writing it?
Yes, and that's actually a big reason why I chose to have a talking bear as the protagonist, because you get this fish out of water kind of quality. He's not part of that society, at least not at the start. He lives in a forest and he doesn't have much to do with people, and he wants to learn. And so that's what sort of Oswald's character arc is to a certain extent. He's a curious bear. He wants to learn about people. And does he ever learn about people, the good, the bad, and the ugly throughout the story? And for that reason, as an author, I get to put him in situations that an insider in that society would not be in, like having explanations given to him about why is society like this? Why do people do this? Because this is actually what the reader is in this situation too. None of the readers is lives around the year 1000. So all of this is going to be new to us as well. And so the reader can sort of stand in Oswald's place and get these explanations without it seeming too ham-fisted. But the goal was always to take you through, to prepare you to read different genres of Old English, mostly prose, just because of the inherent difficulties of the poetic diction. That's a problem I have to solve in the sequel, probably. But so I wanted to introduce people to sort of technical works, like works on astronomy or medicine or sort of proto-scientific concerns. I wanted to introduce people to historical writing, and I wanted to introduce people to religious writing, homilies, saints' lives, things like that. And so I have Oswald go from situation to situation, uh, and in each of these sort of chunks of the text, he's dealing with, he's learning about the sun and the moon, and why the sun looks bigger than the moon, and blah blah blah, this sort of thing. And then he goes from there into a monastery where he learns a little bit about the organization of society, and then he gets involved in, without any spoilers, he gets involved in affairs of state. And then you get to learn about the history of what's been going on in England around the year 1000. And for those who don't know, not a particularly good time to live in England. This is during the sort of the height of the resurgence of uh, Danish raids during the reign of Ethelred the Unready. So there's lots to talk about there. And then there are also points in the text where I adapt authentic selections, not so much so that it's not selections from Old English with a loose frame story around it, but there are quotations here and there. Um, so at one point, Oswald is searching for some sort of he's searching for guidance, and so he opens up. He gets given a book of the four Gospels in Old English, and he opens it up to a page, and he reads, and he gets some inspiration and solves a moral quandary that he's having by reading a parable from the Gospels. And in another chapter, characters try to give each other coded messages using parables. And so that's an opportunity for me to introduce authentic texts from the Wessex Gospels, which is relatively easy prose to the reader. So there are lots of little authorial tricks that I play here and there throughout the book to try and feed people their vitamins in their like you do with a dog when it needs to take medicine. You put the pill in the peanut butter and well, spoonful of sugar, right?
It's I don't think this would constitute a spoiler, but I can edit it out if it does. But at one point you bring in a little bit of The Wanderer, I think. Um, and I was going to say when you mentioned poetry, I think afterwards you do a nice job of like kind of naturally rephrasing some of the more difficult sentences in the paragraph afterwards to kind of I can't exactly remember the specifics, but the way that poetry sometimes the natural phrasing of things is just crammed into the meter, and the meter seems to be more important than natural language. So I think that's a nice way of doing it. Maybe it's something that you found you could only use sparingly, but I thought that was a really nice way of because especially if you've read like The Wanderer 50 times, you don't have much background in Old English, but maybe you've just read literature about it. Um, you end up learning the words and the sequence almost by rote without thinking about a way that you might rephrase the sentences into natural speech. So I thought that was really nice. And another thing about um, from the cultural side of things, talking about vocabulary, approaching obviously you have a little guide to newly introduced words at the end of each chapter, but the fact that you hit the vocabulary first before you go and reference and work out what it is if you have to, um, it sort of it presents it presents the word on its own terms rather than trying to shove it into a modern English category. So like I think there's a chapter on like unrichness or some term like that. And it's like you could translate that as um, various things in modern English, but you risk having kind of religious implications or having kind of too clinical implications. And whereas if you just see it used 30 or so times in different contexts, you build up a semantic map that corresponds as well as possible to what the word actually meant in Old English rather than trying to shove it into a modern concept.
That's certainly the goal. If you haven't seen the book, the way that each chapter is structured is there's the chapter itself, which is all in Old English, and then afterwards there's a word horde, which is actually word horde is an attested. It's used all the time in poetry. People always open their word hordes. So I felt like I could have the chutzpah to use that phrase to mean glossary. And it has a little glossary of all the newly introduced words with modern English glosses. And usually these are, two or three different words to try and give you a sense of the map, the space that this Old English word fills, although they're always imperfect. But the reason that that's afterwards and not before is exactly, I think, what you alluded to there, Simon, which is that you read the text first. You maybe some of these words are mysteries. Maybe there isn't an obvious modern English descendant, or it's opaque in some way. And then you have a bit of a question mark, but you sort of leave it for now, because if I've done my job well, the number of words that are completely opaque to you on the first read shouldn't be too many, and you should probably be able to understand the gist of the story. Then you have in your mind a bunch of unsolved mysteries, a bunch of points of curiosity, and this creates what I like to call a need to know. And you're essentially, it primes you to receive that information. So then you go look, and instead of having a bunch of words to memorize, you have a few mysteries that you want to solve, mysteries that are sort of, in some small way, gnawing away at you. And I find when you introduce new vocabulary with that need to know, it is remarkably easier to keep it, to retain that vocabulary, rather than just giving people a list up front and saying, memorize all of these, then go read. Even though that sounds like a better way of doing it, I find that the opposite is better. And then once you've solved those mysteries, you can go back and reread the chapter. And I do recommend that people reread it, so that they can get a few more repetitions in and sort of iron in those new words. But of course, it depends on how someone wants to read the book. If you just want to read the story, then by all means keep going.
Yeah, it just got me thinking about how in a lot of textbooks that maybe aren't, maybe just archaeology textbooks or something that's not specifically linguistic, just because obviously they can't do several pages of comprehensible input. They'll introduce some term and they'll say the old, the Anglo-Saxon concept of, and then like an Old English word in bold italics or something. And it just feels kind of alien in a way that it doesn't when you just encounter the word, and because when a child is learning a language, if they learn a word like soul, they don't really have to have the concept explained to them. Maybe when they get older, they'll be interested in it and they'll say, what's a soul? Where does it live? But you just gather what it means without having to read the English concept of a soul means. Da, da, da. Um, I think that was a bit of an inane point when it came out of my mouth. It sounded better in my head. Um, but yeah, I think I've gone blank. What else? I'm trying to remember. There was another point I was about to move on to from our email exchange. We, as we said earlier, we mentioned in our email exchange that um, Old English is kind of um, a more maybe a more normal Indo-European language than modern English, in that plenty of Indo-European languages have moved in the direction of being more, would you say, sort of analytic, relying more on auxiliaries and lots of different words to convey meaning. Whereas older Indo-European languages and some modern ones rely on morphology a lot more, on the structure of a word and endings and things like that. So my instinct would be that doing it with Old English, doing comprehensible input with Old English would be a nice way into getting used to that kind of language in general, that more, what's it called? Synthetic, is that the right word?
Mm-hmm.
Because especially if you're interested in history or you're interested in, it's an interesting thing to look into another culture and to kind of understand it better. And I think Old English, just by virtue of being interesting and a little bit alien from a modern perspective, must be a nice way into learning, getting used to things like morphology. Um, would you would you say it's a good starting kind of synthetic language?
Yes, I think it's the best way to start with these languages which are more morphologically complex, such as Latin, such as ancient Greek, such as classical Sanskrit, these sorts of languages where the endings of the words really do matter for telling you who did what to whom. So things like case are relevant here, but also elaborate verb inflections, tenses, voices, moods, all of these things that you need to get used to when you read these other older Indo-European languages. Old English is a good starting point because it's as close as you're ever going to get to modern English. Um, so while still having a language that does all of those things. So Old English is, I always say it's the perfect blend for me anyway of the familiar and the foreign. So you have case morphology. The nouns change to express their relationship with the rest of the sentence, and yet the word for hand is hånd,
Yeah.
and you don't have to worry so much about that. So you have a lot of it's sort of like training wheels. You can start to do these things with much more familiar vocabulary, with some sentence patterns that look very much like modern English because they are the source of modern English's sentence patterns. So some archaic things or things that we still do, but they actually are quite old, such as when we flip the position of the verb in sentences like "never have I ever," blah 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 blah, um, or only with help could I
Mm.
do this. Why do we flip the verb into second position? Or why do we flip the verb there? I won't say second position. Why would we flip the verb there in those sentences? This is a general pattern that we see in Old English where verbs like to occupy um, a position which is called second position, but really it's after the first kind of main phrase in the sentence. So never or only with help count as the first element in the sentence, and then the verb wants to come up right after it. So this is an archaism in modern English, although we probably don't think about it that way as native English speakers ourselves. I'll speak for just the two of us here. Simon, I dare say that when we first encountered that, we didn't think, that sounds like Old English. We probably said, is it nap time? Something more like that. Um, so these are familiar patterns, but then when you see them in Old English applied more broadly, they're not such a big burden
Mm.
to deal with. So I like Old English for that. One thing about related languages is, in general, what it means for them to be related is that they get more similar as you go back in time because they're related, they have a common ancestor, which is the definition. So the closer you get back to that common ancestor, in general, the more alike all these languages will start to look. So Old English looks more like Latin and ancient Greek than modern English looks like either, which is interesting because then you can make that sort of lateral jump over a bit more easily, I think, when you can see that. Not to say it's not still challenging, but fortunately, Latin and especially Latin, but to a certain extent, ancient Greek also has good readers based on these similar kinds of principles of comprehensible input.
Yeah. I I wonder how biased I am because I'm interested in historical um like diachronic descriptions of phonology and stuff like that. But I imagine, well, I know that the sound correspondences are obviously stronger the further back you go as well. Um, so that would probably be tricky to pick up on if you weren't looking out for it. But I suppose that could also be an extra tool because it's quite the spelling choices you make, as with, many people writing Old English textbooks, make it a lot more. Would you say that it's pretty much the pronunciation is predictable from the way you've written it in a way that it maybe isn't in some Old English texts?
That's a tough question, as I'm sure you know the relationship between orthography and phonology is challenging to work out. Um, I'll say two things about that I think can approach the answer. One is that Old English spelling, as you encounter it in manuscript, that's one that's also involves paleography. That's another thing. But in sort of academic edited texts, critical editions, these kinds of things, The spelling, there's no concept of a spelling of a word. This is a very modern concept that only enters much later. And it's very normal to see the same word spelled in two or three different ways on the same page. Not, it doesn't necessarily mean that the scribe changed or anything like that. It's just there wasn't this idea that a word can only be spelled in one way. We have some traces of this left. So if you write and, if you're texting someone, you might write AND, and then the next line write an ampersand,
Mm.
next line write a plus.
Yeah, yeah.
They're all and, but you chose different ways of writing them. Think about that principle and then expand it out to the entire orthography of the language, the entire way the language is spelled. So you will see differences in spelling in different texts. And then there are also differences in scribal traditions, differences in dialect, difference in time periods. So knowing knowing how to read Old English in practice is actually a little bit more complicated than what textbooks tell you, including Oswald Bera. But I'm of the belief that it's easier to approach that complexity once you have a base. You have a sort of idealized version of Old English, which is always spelled one way, that you can then relate the variations to. And so that's what I've done in Oswald Bera. I've done something like textbook Old English, which is very common. I think all Old English textbooks do this. They'll typically spell things in a kind of standardized early West Saxon way that makes all of the phonological rules really clean. And then when you get to real text, they say, oh, by the way, this thing that we've been spelling IE, it's pretty much always going to be spelled Y in this text. Why? Late West Saxon. So that's I've maintained that tradition mainly because I spell things in this sort of idealized early West Saxon way, mainly because I want people to be able to look things up in dictionaries more easily. Wiktionary uses the standard. Sweet's dictionary for students uses this standard. So I wanted interoperability with that. Although I did use late West Saxon grammar, which is a bit, we can probably talk about that choice in a little bit, um, but the other side is the choice I've made is to act as if there is a relatively clear correspondence between orthography and phonology. So when I teach people in classes, we use spoken Old English a lot, and I give them a way to pronounce it that's very similar to the reconstruction that you have on your video, uh, Simon. It's perhaps an idealization to a certain extent because it's a theory, it's a reconstruction, it's a hypothesis. So it's always going to be an idealization to a certain extent. But if we're honest about that, I think it can be a very useful one. So hopefully that from two angles somewhat approaches answering your question.
It does. And I think something else to think about is, which you will have thought about as well, is the fact that for any given Old English speaker, all languages have variability for, within speaker variability. But for a given Old English speaker, there was probably pretty much one phonological form of each word. Obviously, it differs when you go to another region, or maybe social class made a difference. But if the same scribe was spelling the same word differently three times on one page, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were pronouncing it just differently every time they said it. So if you and then a reader approaching it will recognize it kind of as a whole word that they just have a phonological kind of template of in their head, rather than a native Old English reader presumably wouldn't very often look at a word and be like, what's that supposed to be? They just kind of fairly intuitively work it out. And I suppose reading Oswald Bera gives you almost a proxy of a basic phonological form of each word that you can store in your head, which you can then, when you approach weird spellings in texts, you can then quickly just go, oh, that's just a weird way of spelling this word I know, rather than trying to piece together whether this is the same word as this, because now that you have a more implicit understanding of the language, you'll know from context that it must be this word. It's just spelt a little bit unusually.
Exactly. Exactly. It's always easier to build a bridge from the known into the unknown rather than starting with the unknown and trying to make your way back to back home somehow. It's much harder. I find students after they finished Oswald Bera. So typically when I teach Oswald Bera first, and then I bring students into unadapted, unnormalized prose texts of a roughly the same, maybe a little bit lower complexity compared to the last part of Oswald Bera. And students are usually pretty nervous. How, the spelling isn't normalized. How am I going to deal with this? That worry disappears after about 2 or 3 weeks. They just get used to it. It's really not that hard to get used to, even though it seems like it's going to be a big deal. So to anyone studying Old English, learn a standard and then you can pretty easily go from that. The principle of teaching from the known into the unknown also applies to things like poetry. One thing that I've found really useful when teaching poetry, and it comes down to the way that this is very much related to the way that I introduce poems in Oswald Bera, which is, as you said, I introduce the poem and then I give a little bit of a rephrase, try and integrate it into the story so that it doesn't sound just like a straight rephrase. Um, Oswald's contemplating the meaning and saying, "Oh, this is actually a lot like me. I do this, I do that." Um, but it's really useful to take poetry with its special diction, its the rigors of meter, and relate it to a prose equivalent of the same sentence. So once you've learned a good prose vocabulary, you can go and look at different poetic words. So for those who haven't read Old English poetry, when you're reading Old English poetry, a lot of the competence that you're building up is finding what are the 27 synonyms for sword? What are the 35 synonyms for spear? And all the ones that alliterate on every different letter. So you have a little chart, spear, okay, with G, okay, it's gar. You know, you go through, or sword, oh, with S it is swerd, with B it's bill, you go on. But it's good to have that prose word connected them all so that when I teach students Beowulf, they see things like all these compounds that start with guth or we. These are poetic words for battle and often occurring compounds. And like guth fremmende, which means something like war working, accomplishing war, fighting, essentially. But it's okay. Guth. What's our normal word for that? Yewin. This is the sort of the prosy word for war, or at least one that's pretty common. So whenever we encounter a new word like this, a poetic compound or a strange word, say, Guth fremmende, wirkende Yewin, working war. And okay, now we understand. We can bring it back into something we know, rather than having to cut out the Old English out and just saying, well, Guthfremmende means accomplishing war. That I think is a lot less useful than recasting it in prose Old English that they know.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very nice approach. Um, did you want to talk a little bit about choices of kind of how you've sort of standardized it for the sake of the book? Uh,
Hmm.
I imagine it was driven a lot by kind of what the texts that people approach are most likely to be written in. But then you have all sorts of weird changes, random bits that seem to be in different dialects and stuff in Beowulf and things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Not by any means simple. So I made a choice that is a little bit less usual. So I spell things as if they are early West Saxon, but grammatically I follow a late West Saxon standard, which seems maybe a little bit strange, but when you go into reading prose, the majority of what you'll be reading is going to be in late West Saxon. And the differences here are, from the grammar are predominantly in a few endings here and there. And generally they're more complicated in early West Saxon. So you get these kinds of these singular well, what would be the best example? So in early West Saxon, plural nominative adjectives, strong adjectives, have different endings depending on the gender. In late West Saxon, they typically all just take "e" as their ending. That's a bit less to deal with for a student coming in, and especially in those crucial early chapters where things are not everything's new in the first chapter. So I'm very careful not to overwhelm people, but I wanted to use adjectives a lot. And I thought, "Oh, if they're going to have to keep track of three different endings for the genders, I think that would be a bit harder than having the one in late West Saxon, which is, by the way, what they're going to be reading most of anyway in prose. So I took the same approach as I took with normalization. Teach them something, a useful standard, and then complicate it later. And so that is one reason. That's one sort of very nuts and bolts reason why I chose late West Saxon. The other reason is I set the book in the year 1000. So late West Saxon was a more appropriate a more appropriate form of the language for the time period of the book. So those are the two main reasons I chose late West Saxon.
Mhm.
But spelling it in early West Saxon slightly strangely perhaps, but that's to ensure compatibility with dictionaries that the students are likely to use, which is by and large Wiktionary because it's the most convenient for everyone.
When there are things related to gender and things like that, which um, you might have opted for a more collapsed form of, where there was an option um, in where there was a precedent for it in some dialect of Old English. I suppose that's the kind of thing where if the main objective is to read Old English, I don't imagine it would impede comprehension that much if because if something has a slightly unexpected ending, but you have a good competency with reading Old English, then you're going to be able to work it out from context, and soon you'll get used to um, that
Exactly.
variance.
There are situations where, and this is something that I've been of two minds about this. There are situations where you have uncommon variants that are simpler versus the vastly more common variant that's more complex. And there are cases to be made on either side. I talked about this on Substack recently about the word holt. Holt is means wood or either the material or the trees together, a wood. And in the first chapter of Oswald, I use holt to refer to where Oswald lives. Oswald wonath on holte. Not the most common word for forest in Old English. That'd be wudu, which is also very comprehensible for modern English speaker, but it has the disadvantage of being a little bit more complicated to decline. And as a result, I steered clear of that and gave something a bit more simple in a bit simpler in chapter one, despite the fact that it's less typical. I could see an argument for doing it the other way. You know, it just comes down to philosophy. And basically, what I do in the first 7 chapters of the book is err on the side of ease. And then after that, once I feel everyone has a good foundation under them, I switch and I err on the side of frequency or typicality. But it's, I think, by no means an obvious choice to make. You don't, I think you don't want to give people an impression of the language that's overly simplified and not like what they're going to encounter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have that overriding principle that they have to keep reading. So if they put down the book after chapter one, you don't get to do any fancy things. Whatever you were going to do in chapter 28, it's irrelevant. So I think there are trade-offs to be made there. But I think that I think I like to think I came to a good solution. We'll see. We'll see. The books have been out for just under a month, so maybe some people are starting to finish them, and they can yell at me for what I did to the characters
Yeah.
soon enough.
Feel free to leave positive comments only, not joking. By the way, sorry that I keep darting my eyes there because you're there for me and the camera's there. So I'm conscious of trying to look into the camera, but
I have
also
the same. I've tried. I've been playing with it. I've tried to get the zoom as close to the camera as possible. So hopefully it's not too.
yeah. No, I hadn't noticed at all. I feel like everyone does a better job than me. I used to tape my camera onto the um, screen because it doesn't clip, but I found it's more stable and doesn't fall off as much if I put it there. Um, I've had two kind of parallel experiences with the book. One, reading it myself, having obviously not, I obviously have holes in my understanding of grammar and stuff, but I've got experience with the language, so the first chapter was not a problem. Um, and it then was very kind of easy to approach the later chapters. And also Luke, the video you did with Luke, who I gather didn't really have any um, recent experience learning or reading Old English. Is that right at the time?
No, when we did that video, he hadn't touched Old English at all.
Um, so he was a beginner that obviously understood lots of other languages with similar inflectional morphology. Um, and in that video, you sort of walk him through it and do sort of drawings and things. Do you have do you have much of an idea of um, if somebody were to pick up the book and they just owned the book and I guess they could it'd probably be a good idea for them to go and watch that video because it sort of helps them get into it. If you do have the book and you haven't come across that video yet. But do you think the approach there is to just read the first chapter, look at the vocabulary afterwards, read it again, and just try to translate it basically, and then maybe at that point they have enough vocabulary that they can go on reading it as more or less as normal. Um, which
Yes, by and large, that's the strategy I recommend.
yeah.
I have a video actually up on my channel which explains here's what I think is the ideal way to use the book. And it's basically like that. So you read it, you accumulate these unsolved mysteries, you look at the vocabulary, you solve them temporarily, you go back, read, see what sticks. Then if there are still any unsolved mysteries, solve them, go back and read. So it's a multiple stage process. It's somewhat similar. Luke Raniere has a video like this where he has his multi-stage approach to reading. Mine is slightly different, but I think they both use this principle that rereading is an extremely underrated tool. Simply rereading, between the first and the second time will boost your comprehension in ways that if you haven't done it, you would not expect. I have time and time again students who they read the text, say this is a more advanced student, so we're reading authentic text. They read the text, they come to class, oh, Colin, I couldn't make heads nor tails of it. This is a really hard text. I say, well, let's see. Let's go through it together. And we go through it together. And, I explain things here or there, but by and large, they just understand it on the second read through without too much help from me. And they say, well, what? That's weird because I didn't understand it before. Now I do now. It's like, well, yeah, this is actually how it is supposed to work. So I always recommend rereading because you can get to that stage without your teacher. If you don't have a teacher, you could be your own teacher.
I like it's just occurred to me the you have as well questions after each chapter um, for you know getting people into thinking about it and in the same way that they do in kind of reading comprehension classes at school where they'll have questions about it. Um, and I think it's nice the way you drop questions in at first as well into the text. So there's almost the brain almost um, it almost builds up a probabilistic understanding of if this is the question, what is the answer kind of thing. And it gets into thinking about it in that, because you obviously can't have a conversation with someone through a book. And that's one thing that's just an inherent drawback of purely learning from a book. And I feel like that's the closest thing you can get to having a conversation with someone to sort of pose a question to them. And I imagine that's a staple of a lot of methods of language teaching, but I thought it was very, very engaging.
Oh, thank you. It's basically it's a technique called circling, where you go. It's a teaching technique that's very closely aligned to methods that use a lot of comprehensible input. So you go through a text. I'll use modern English as an example. Um, the In the forest there is a tree. What's in the forest? A tree. Where's the tree? It's in the forest. Oh. And there's a bird in the tree. What's in the tree? A bird. Where's the bird? In the tree. The bird is white. What color is the bird? This sort of thing. So the idea is you give some text and then you circle around it and sort of ask questions about everything you can, which gives more repetitions on all of those things, gives repetitions on the question grammar as well, while you're at it, and really targets comprehension, make sure that they understand everything. So that's what I did in that video with Luke. I have a revised video because that's a fairly old draft of the book. So I have a revised version of the coming that'll be coming out on my channel in the next couple weeks or so of the first chapter so that people can see. And basically you ask questions, you circle around every sentence that you give. And so in the first chapter of the book, I think also maybe a little bit in the second, I incorporate this circling into the text itself because I know that I'm not going to be there with you when you're reading it. So I want to give you some of that, especially in this really crucial first chapter where so much is new to you. Everything, the whole language is potentially new to you if this is your first Old English text. And I want it to be as easy as possible. And then obviously that would be intrusive if I kept it up through the whole book. You're reading this huge, battle scene. Who hit him with the sword? That would be probably a bit, deflate the tension a little bit. But it gets you into the text, and I think to a point where you can more or less go on your own at a speed that will differ from person to person, depending on their prior experience and their, any number of things. But the comprehension questions are there at the end of the chapter, mainly to ensure, well, you can use them in different ways, but I like to use them to ensure that you understood the plot before you proceed. If there are questions in there that you don't understand, that you don't know at all, then I think it's wise to spend more time with the chapter before going on. And gets into that sort of multi-step reading method. After I think it's after the first read, look at the comprehension questions. If there's anything that's unclear to you, spend deliberate attention in that part. And they're all chronologically ordered, so it describes the events of the chapter in order. Because if you don't understand what's going on, then you're going to lose that comprehensibility. So you won't have the basis to understand the new things because you won't understand the old things. So that's a large reason why I included those questions.
I feel like it must. I feel like I've heard Luke or you talk about it in a video at some point, but I feel like having a almost like a semantic memory of effectively of a situation that's described, but that's entirely gone in through Old English rather than modern English must really help as well to kind of embed it as a communicative system in your head, like a meaningful system of communication rather than just a set of rules.
Exactly. By being asked a question about the content, it sort of divorces the content from those exact words used to describe it. And now you're thinking about a situation. And we've now used two, we've gone over it twice. We've gone over as the statement and as the question. So you start to understand, what is actually going on there and what's its relationship to the language, which is not always extremely direct.
And then another thing you do that's quite nice, I'll try and phrase this in a way that's not spoilery, but every so often you find a narrative way of basically recapping the story in brief, which also I guess does the same kind of thing. It sort of goes over the whole thing, cements it in your mind, uses different wording, and yeah, it seems like it's extremely well honed to the task. It's almost so obvious it doesn't need saying, but to encounter it as a living language, because I think a lot of people's experience with Old English is just, kind of statements like this modern English word comes directly from the Anglo-Saxon language and it comes from this root word meaning, and it leads you to think of it as this fragmentary thing that contributed a little bit to modern English in some abstract way rather than the straight the ancestor of modern English that was a living language, that all of these words were used conversationally and it's not some magical alien source of words, in the distant past. Um, and yeah, I've not phrased that very well, but it's a lovely way into it as a living language.
If you have the etymologist's approach to Old English, which is, it's the source. Hey, this word comes from this word. This word comes from this Old English word. You can understand Old English as as a bank of words, but you only understand those words sort of in isolation. You don't understand their relationships to each other. You don't understand the well, really much about the grammar. You don't understand the other half, the dark side of the moon, so to speak. The words in Old English that didn't survive,
Yeah, yeah,
which, it's just by chance in many cases that those words didn't survive. And they were just as much a part of the language as anything else. And so to understand Old English only in terms of its effect on modern English, you get it's essentially what do they call it? Survivorship bias? I don't
yeah,
know. Something like that. You don't get a sense of the whole thing, and you certainly don't get a sense of it as a living and breathing thing. I myself use in my teaching of Old English, and obviously I wrote a book, so I'm definitely into using Old English and producing it. But mainly my goal in this is not to, start an Old English Renaissance where people are, walking down the street and greeting each other in Old English and buying their milk and bread in Old English. But it's to make us better readers, essentially, to give us a real felt sense of the language, to get it into our bones, so that when we go to read, it's something familiar, it's something that we kind of possess or that possesses us, rather than something abstract that we have to sort of work with and negotiate with. It's something that we carry with us, and I think that speaking the language as much as possible in class, and writing in the language as well. I mean, heavens, writing this book changed my Old English for the better. When I started, I was, well, I'll put it this way: I learned a lot through the process because there are so many things that you never encounter in the grammar. You take a typical grammar of Old English, it'll tell you all the endings, it'll tell you a few facts about the word order, when to use the subjunctive, and this kind of thing. But until you're actually faced with a sentence like, um, he went into the city without having been seen. How on earth do you write that in Old English?
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, so you have to then move beyond those grammars and just immerse yourself in texts and read and read and read until you find some construction that's like what you are trying to do. And if you read and read and read and read and read and read tens and hundreds of thousands of words, some of them will be the same words over and over again, but that does something to you. Purely spending 100 hours reading a language will transform your ability in the language.
yeah.
So imagine if you're also doing that with a very, very pressing need to make use of that knowledge to write something, that sharpens it even more. And so, I can't really recommend this as a technique for most people. If you want to improve at Old English, write a book. Not really practical, but it does work.
Yeah, I've tried to compose bits of Old English, much to the chagrin, however you pronounce that word, of people who know more about the grammar. So I've learned my lesson and stopped doing that for the most part. But it's true. You you learn so much about word choices, and you sort of spot yourself trying to use just use whatever the old form of the modern English word is, rather than looking at what the actual word frequencies are. Was it some word that we don't have anymore? Um, and as you say, sentence constructions, sort of broad pragmatic things that a textbook could never fit in every possible sentence construction. And I've done a similar thing of like rooting around trying to find parallel sentence constructions in texts. Um, and it's something I've struggled with enormously. So it's very, very nice to um, I don't know, it gives me more admiration for you having to write an entire book in it, um and just follow the narrative of the book, rather than, you can't be like, oh, I can't find a way of saying that. So you have to really like root around and try to find um, parallels in the literature.
Yeah, well, I would say the first thing though, Simon, is I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't stop composing.
Mhm.
Um, I think mistakes are inevitable. Mistakes are, this sounds so cheesy. I'm sorry, but mistakes are part of the learning process. Um, I think to get rid of them is to get rid of the sort of the life. So, obviously we want to make as few mistakes as possible, especially me, especially in print. But inevitably, I'm sure there will be some unidiomatic ways of phrasing things, which I'll try and fix in a second edition. But I think that the best attitude to take with that is to just to allow yourself to produce. I think having having as free an attitude as possible is really helpful for a learner. And we're all learners. There's no native speaker of of Old English on this planet, to my knowledge. Although some of my students did have yeah, very young children, and they may have been sitting in on the Zooms, so you never know what's going to happen in a few years. But that would be that would be something.
Imagine. Yeah, I'd enjoy that very much. And then the child refuses to acquire modern English.
Well, I had an interesting email because one of the things, oh no, it wasn't an email. Well, it was a conversation I had at one point. And one of the things that the book does differently from one very famous analog, which is the Orberg's Lingua Latina per se illustrata series. That is aptly named. It is per se illustrata. It's explained in its own terms. So the new words are explained in Latin, which is wonderful because it doesn't matter what your first language is, you can come to that book and hopefully learn. Um, I didn't take that approach in Oswald Bera. I thought the difficulty the difficulty of trying to define every word in Old English, or purely through being extremely self-explanatory in the story, would either require me to slow down the story so much or to make it like very unnatural and less enjoyable to read that I didn't think it was worth it. And so I do gloss things in modern English. And I also thought practically, I'm trying to imagine, and maybe this is true, maybe there is such a person. I'm trying to imagine someone who is only interested in Old English and not at all in modern English,
Mm.
and doesn't know modern English at all, but is really interested in Old English. And I think that demographic may exist, but we're not talking about very many people here.
Yeah, yeah.
So I felt, that was a sacrifice worth making, where I took a different approach to that series. That series is fantastic. I love it, but in this case, I don't think it's worth the worth that sacrifice.
By making it so easy to read as well, it's you know, it's perfectly possible that someone who doesn't have that much of an interest in Old English, but it's just kind of it piques their interest and they're like, oh, maybe I'll see what this is about, and then they get through it, and then they have a better understanding than a lot of people who've been interested in Old English for years and haven't really tried to learn it. And it sort of brings new people in, and there's such a low barrier to entry in terms of it's not like you don't feel like you're sitting there. It's thoroughly enjoyable to read. You don't feel like you're sitting there poring over a textbook at all. Um, and like you say, you want to know what the words mean. You want to know what happens. It's a task. You have an incentive to try to understand what's being said because you want to know what happens. Um, yeah, I
Well,
wonder.
I'm glad to hear you say that. It's that it doesn't feel like time spent with a textbook, which is
No,
good. That's what I was going for. Um, it's 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 a difficult task to well, okay, I'll put it this way. I tell people I've written a book in Old English, and they say, well, that's a bit niche, isn't it? So certainly it is. It certainly is. However, it's not set in stone that Old English has so many people interested in it. part of the reason that Old English is as niche as it is because there aren't, or there historically haven't been, so many resources for the language. And your channel is a good example of positive movement. So I think that, I don't mean to flatter you, but I think that the videos that you've done in Old English have raised the profile of the language and created more fans, created more people interested in the language. And I
And
hope that the book does the same by giving people an easy way into the language. The number of Old English aficionados on the planet is not a fixed number, and we can grow it, and you have been doing so.
no, that's without directly accepting the compliment. That is true that it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's niche because um, if it's niche, if it's so niche, no one will bother to try to create resources to um, make it more widely known because it seems like you know, they assume that because it's niche, it will always be niche. And I do think this book is just on another level of, there's such a lot of it as well. It's just such, when you pick up, you get like even a textbook, you get a new textbook and you're like, look at all this fun information and then often the textbook's written in such a way that you have to do it in small chunks. But with this, it's such a lot of nice material all at once that I think it will really make a difference. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I hope so. I hope so. People, it's a weird world, the world of the Anglo-Saxons. It's like the language. It's familiar, especially to those who live in England, even southern Scotland, I guess. This is a familiar territory. The towns are the same in a lot of cases. The landscape is very similar. You can talk about the place names that you know. You read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle about battles that happened sort of at somewhere that's now a rest stop where you can go grab a
Unfeasible.
cheeky Nando's. Like that's the bizarre thing about it. Um, and so it has that mixture of the familiar and the foreign. And so it's I think something that can potentially appeal to a lot of people, even if they are not themselves living in England. But the heritage of the language that they speak goes back there, and maybe their local town is named after a town that was that is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. You never know.
And even so, just me having barely been to the US, I still get a sense of um, a real sense of kind of culture rooted in landscape, even, states I've never been anywhere near, just from, watching things and reading literature. So even if there's no connection, it's still just interesting to um, approach this other world. Um,
I'll give you an example. So I live in Canada, but it's a very similar situation. And there's a town near where I live called Ancaster. And I had occasion the other night to discuss the etymology of this, Ancaster. Oh, this is the Chester, this is the Chaster, the towns that are the descendants of the old Roman forts in Britain. And here it is in a completely different continent. There's that word, and so you get to experience that sort of that thread. You get to pull on that thread a little bit and see where it leads you.
yeah, I apologize for doing the classic British thing of hearing a North American accent and jumping to a US example. I did have in my head that you live in Canada because it's in the Zoom invite and it's been mentioned before, so apologies for that.
No, I don't. I don't take offense.
Uh,
Americans are great.
I think that's a good amount of information. So would you like to introduce us to the hard copy of the book?
Yes, this is the advanced reader copy. I was checking all the punctuation and all the accent marks, but this is more or less what it looks like without the blue band. And so you can see there's Oswald there on the cover. Um, and his little friend Athelstan.
And
You can hear his story if you read the book. If you want to pick it up, you can just go to oswaldbera.com, spelled like this, and it ships more or less worldwide.
well, I'm very excited to get my hard copy, which you've very kindly said you'll send. And there is also at some point in due course going to be an audiobook, which Colin has very kindly asked me to help with. So that'd be that'd be very exciting to be involved in. And I think the hearing it spoken element will add an extra thing to it. But yeah, we will see when that comes together. But in the meantime, I would very thoroughly recommend reading the book.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking with you.